Talk. Is that okay? I'll just take a minute.
Yes, we are live. Hi everyone, I'm Deyasini Roy, and I welcome you all to the Stories of Forced Migration and the TMYS Reviews March 2022 project in association with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. We are seeking submissions in the form of essays, stories, and poems. The registrations for our advanced writing workshop are also open. To know more about the architecture of our presently ongoing projects, please visit our website www.tellmeyourstory.biz. The topic of our digital conversation today is psychological trauma, a scarring aftermath of forced migration. And we have with us Professor Ankur Datta, Professor Giorgia, Doná, and Miss Khushboo, Mattoo, who through their years of rigorous involvement in this field are experts in the field of discussion. Before we move on to hear and engage with our speakers, I would like to quickly introduce them. Professor Ankur Datta teaches in the Department of Sociology, South Asian University. His work addresses themes of displacement and victimhood. He has published articles in journals such as History and Anthropology, Modern Asian Studies, and contributions to Indian sociology. He is the author of On Uncertain Ground, Displaced Kashmiri Pundits in Jammu and Kashmir, Oxford University Press, 2017. We welcome you, sir. We also have with us Professor Giorgia Doná. She is Professor of Forced Migration and co-editor of the Centre for Migration, Refugees and Belonging at the University of East London, UK. For more than 3 decades, she has worked as a researcher, practitioner, and activist with refugees in Central America, Eastern Africa, and Europe. Her research focuses on psychosocial perspectives in forced migration, conflict and displacement, child and youth migration, refugee voices and representation, and multimodal narratives. Recent single and co edited publications include The Marginalized in Genocide Narratives 2020, Forced Migration, Current Issues and Debates 2019, and Child and Youth Migration, Mobility in Migration in an Era of Globalization 2014. We welcome you, ma'am, and a very good afternoon to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon
We,
to you all.
we also have Ms. Khushboo Mattoo joining us today. She is a consulting editor with Network 18 and a columnist with multiple publications. She writes often about the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits and is a researcher of migration studies and policies. She has been a part of various campaigns on radio and TV involving social injustice and taboos of the society, especially related to exploitation and drug abuse. We welcome you to today's discussion. And this is to inform all of you that Tisha Mujumdar, due to physical indisposition, would not be able to conduct the session today. I will take the session ahead for today. And here's wishing Tisha a super speedy recovery. I am Deyasini Roy. I have recently completed my master's in English and Comparative Literature from Pondicherry University, India. I'm published in several national and international journals and anthologies of repute. I'm also a senior project assistant at Tell Me a Story. So, without further ado, I would now like to invite Professor Ankur Datta to share his insights on the topic of today's discussion. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dashni, and thanks to Tell Me Your Story for the invitation to come and speak here and to be part of this panel. Uh, well, there's a lot that can be said, so I'm actually going to pick on one or two moments or themes that still preoccupy me, in which I draw on my earlier work. Though the argument what I seek to make speaks with general interest, but I tend to think with the older work I had done. So I want to begin. I'll just read out, and this is it's sort of a monologue I had heard um, when I was doing research. So for my doctorate, I was doing research among displaced Kashmiri Pandits in Jammu and Kashmir, and I did fieldwork in Jammu from 2005 to 2007, and would visit the city from time to time after that until recently. So this is an encounter with a Kashmiri Pandit migrant, as they're referred to in official nomenclature, and it wasn't much of a conversation. I just sat there listening to this man speak. And I'll just read out something he had said because these are words that still affect me immensely. And it's a conversation which actually took place in English. So this is what he said when he was talking. To quote him, the main question is, what is the effect of migration? Think of a person. You'll see a man simply talking to himself. Look, 50 men will come. You will definitely see some are letting their hands drop, some are talking to themselves. That means they're not mentally sound, not mentally fit. There is depression. You are here to see our condition. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here if we were sound, if we were fine. You are here to research, and that is the question. And that means something has happened to we people. A man should be fit in every respect. He should be fit, he should be smiling. You should look at their faces, but no one is smiling. No doubt they put on their shirt, but internally they're weeping. They put on laughter challenge shows. Ha ha ha. But no one is looking inside. Is every Kashmiri getting better? What more do they need? If you're alive, what for are you alive? What for am I here? I'm living, I'm sleeping. Man is not born for just these things. If he was born for just these things, there's no difference between a dog and a man. Only difference between a dog and a human? Who knows? A dog is alive, I'm alive. What is the difference? This excerpt took place is from an encounter I had, as I mentioned, which was very end 2006, early 2007. So it's actually quite some time ago. But it's remained with me ever since because it spoke to many of the kind of issues and questions of psychic pain, even though I'm not a psychologist. But it spoke to a lot of the emotional distress, which one sees often happening with forced migrant populations, and of course populations that have faced chronic displacement. Forced migration and displacements of population during times of war, conflict, disasters, or dispossession induced by development and capital projects are a feature of the modern world and contemporary life. Moments that lead to the creation of a population of refugees or internally displaced persons, IDPs, or people who fall in the cracks as they're forced out of place are met by horror, whether we experience them up close or whether we simply witness them from a screen. The moment of displacement is a break that causes a loss of many things. It causes a loss of the tangible, homes, property, landscapes. It causes a break of the intangible, such as the loss of relationships, relationships in this case speaking to kinship, speaking to friendship, or a sense of a relationship to a place, a kind of emotional relationship to a place. And, to be quite honest, a loss of a sense of security that one could trust in. In some ways, this separation, of course, is not always possible. You can't separate the tangible from the intangible. As the writer John Berger once commented when he was writing about labor migrants, but I think it applies here, home, wherever that may be, or wherever we make it, centers us. The loss of home is a moment of decentering. And we cannot ignore the immediate physical threats that emerge when populations have to flee their homes to save their lives, only then having to find ways to survive in difficult conditions. What makes matters perhaps difficult is the relationship and attitude that migrants seem to face of all kinds. Migrants are not broadly approved by states, as they are people out of place. We can see this in the response of regimes in Europe towards the many crossing the Mediterranean Sea in this life. And it is not uncommon for refugees to be treated as a threat, or as with some suspicion by local populations, as we see in the case of Rohingyas across South Asia. While the event of displacement is marked by acute threats shaped by the demands of immediate survival, the aftermath, or the period after, is also important, which can last for a few months to even a generation or two, especially in situations of protracted displacement. Much reportage focuses on wars, events, and extraordinary situations. And that is expected. Events stand out, the extraordinary stand out. But the challenge of dealing with trauma is most evident in the everyday life that is resumed after the event. As Rebecca Lester points out, the trauma faced by displaced peoples involves a complex range of experiences and responses, which may persist over time, even when things appear to have settled. Trauma may persist over time and may even change in meaning as new experiences accumulate. I mean, I'm here, accumulate. While there is much that can be discussed, of course, even further, um, I'm going to talk a bit. I want to bring the discussion back to the situations where displaced populations are faced with chronic situation. So, for example, my earlier work explores experience of displacement with reference to the Kashmiri Pandits who were displaced in 1990. But the fact of the matter is, 1990 is 30 years ago. I mean, one sees a whole generation or even the second generation coming of age. What I saw were people who seemed to remake and rebuild their lives to various degrees of success and failure. Some overcame hardship successfully, creating life anew, but it was life anew. While many others still struggle across different sites. When I did my research, you had these camps that were around the city of Jammu, which of course have been now replaced by a single township of displaced people for one segment of the migrant population. And in the meantime, the conflict over Kashmir continues. There is still continued militarization. There's still continued violence. I mean, recently there were a series of killings of civilians in the Kashmir Valley. And also in other situations, refugees, even after several decades, may continue to be vulnerable. And here I'm thinking of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, who were made refugees with the formation of Israel in 1948 and were subject to violence during the Lebanese Civil War. And one thinks of the massacres of Shabra and Shatila that took place. The difficulties, again, faced by different groups can vary, and no experience of forced migration and displacement, and I use forced migration to include both refugees and internally displaced persons, can be deemed identical. One cannot ignore the cost of physical health for those facing chronic displacement. And when I was doing my research, people would talk about illnesses such as diabetes, the increased incidence of which would be blamed on displacement. But yet, as the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard observed, it's easier to talk of a physical malady than that which affects mind and emotion. It's easier to talk about I have a broken hand than to say that I am depressed. Issues of mental health constantly surface among displaced populations, often as a response to immediate conditions such as life in limited space in camps, to the continued to possible threats of life, situations of hostility, possibly from local communities, hostility or indifference or apathy from the state and maybe larger political society, and from a larger sense of uncertainty of what the future holds. Even if life is remade, where can one imagine a future where life can be lived with some matter of dignity? A lot of the discussion, of course, of remaking life after displacement has taken place in South Asia. A lot of the scholarship, of course, scholars like Veena Das have been very critical to the conversation. But I sometimes wonder then, what does this remaking involve? One sees this, of course, in light of partition refugees. So many people from Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs who became refugees in 1947, with movement back and forth between India and Pakistan and what's now Bangladesh. Now, several generations have, of course, passed, at least 2 or 3 generations. And while the generations that succeeded the refugees are mostly settled citizens, and who in turn may even be suspicious of newer cohorts of refugees, what emerges in more recent cases is the continued awareness of uncertainty. While one may have sanctuary now, will that sanctuary last? Or even if I feel safe and secure otherwise, is there economic security, or do I have to look to other options or avenues or other places and other sites for a possible future? Can a possible future that enables dignified life after chronic displacement be imagined as actualized? In fact, sometimes nostalgia or a stylized remembrance of the past may interfere, where the past is only seen in positive light, a light, making the present pale in comparison. This was something I encountered in my work, and which also emerges in scholarship on situations on refugees across the world. Here I'm thinking of Dipesh Chakraborty's as this essay on the memories of East Bengali Hindu refugees. And you see this in a lot of other work. Lisa Malki was very critical to the discussion also on the idea of mythical history. And And what perhaps also becomes a bit of a problem is that while one may look to the past in some ways um, for some relief, the past may indeed be a foreign country impossible to reattain. And this itself could be a source of continued psychic harm, if one thinks about it. A final point I want to make pertains to recognition and acknowledgement. And the question is, who do we recognize as a refugee? For example, what distinguishes a refugee from an IDP or internally displaced person? How are they to be distinguished in terms of other migrants of the world marked by migration, especially when one sees people compelled to move because economically their lives are difficult to sustain? And I mean, I'm thinking of stories of people who move from rural India to different parts of urban India. I remember meeting people from Chhattisgarh who were in Jammu working as construction labor, and the main reason they're there is because agriculture was not paying enough. One could not imagine how they could survive. To be recognized, of course, as a refugee or an IDP is essential to receiving any kind of support. And of course, these are legally recognized categories. These are categories that make sense to the state. They are a part of popular culture, they're a part of law and policy, and they are recognized in the public. The term refugee, of course, more so, is something that evokes a reaction. Nevertheless, this remains a concern, especially when displaced populations continue to be mistreated, ignored, or seen as threats to those deemed local or indigenous. Threats in terms of taking over place, threats over competition over resources. And the Rohingyas become the classic case here, where there are many reports that come out of them being subject to suspicion, occasionally attack, and so on and so forth, or alleged attack. But nevertheless, they are seen as a potential threat. Sometimes, because displaced populations, when recognized, may be eligible or receive humanitarian assistance or special assistance from the state, may become seen as privileged, ironically, by other communities. That, wow, these guys are lucky, they're getting so much. And that itself harms, because rather than see one's experience of violence, suffering, and one's experience of victimhood being recognized, it falls in suspicion. At times, the experiences of the displaced may even be discounted by other groups, civil society, political parties, the state, or may face misrepresentation or even misuse. What kind of damage then can recognition, misrecognition, or the denial of acknowledgement do to the displaced, whether we see displaced peoples as a collective, as a group, or even as an individual? These issues, among others, become even more significant in a world marked by migration, situations of protracted displacement, and of course, conflict that does not seem to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Datta. That
You're
was
welcome. Thank you.
quite informative and a wonderful take on the topic of today's discussion. Moving on, I would like to hand it over to Professor Giorgia to present her perspectives on the topic in discussion. Professor, over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to start with a kind of a brief understanding of the situation that us as a humanity are experiencing as together, because COVID and the pandemic have actually shown that we share a lot with populations that have been subjected to conflict and displacement. And therefore, we can have an empathy for some of the experiences that have been, that many populations are going through. We have fear of the unknown and danger and threat. We have anxiety about what we can and we cannot control. We have an increased sense of vulnerability, mistrust of the other, loneliness and separation, for some losses and mourning, and at times mental health issues. This description of some of the social and personal conditions that we have been experiencing through the last few years of the coronavirus pandemic are experiences that many people undergo conflicts, experience for long times, and as the previous speaker said, sometimes have generational impacts. And it is in this context of understanding crises like the pandemic, wars, natural disasters, displacements, and development-induced movements that we can see how this can be described as traumatic events, something that happens outside that creates a wound. And these traumatic events can be both individual but also collective and global. These crises are global. And therefore, the wound that they create, that we call trauma, needs to be understood from my perspective through the lens of ecologies of traumas, because it needs to be understood in the context of what individuals experience and how they interpret the events and the suffering that they may go through. So when I think of trauma, I think of the emotional and psychological trauma. Psyche means the soul in Greece, but I also think of the social trauma, of the ways in which interpersonal relationships have been affected, relationship of trust, feelings of safety are undermined by suffering and traumatic events, and also cultural traumas, the ways in which symbols, role models that we have kind of taken for granted may become ways of life suddenly become dismantled. And I want to give an example of this kind of intersecting dimensions and ecologies of trauma from my research with Guatemalan refugees who are the descendants of the Mayans in Central America. Guatemalan refugees were located in refugee camps in Mexico along the Mexican border. And when I visited them and I was collecting their stories, they were often telling me of the collective experience of trauma that they were experiencing. They were telling me that it wasn't just them as individuals or even as a group that was suffering, but the trees, the plants, the rivers were also crying. And within their ecology, it is important to understand the meaning of their distress in context. In the same way in which they were saying that, they were using the Christian image of the cross and Christ to draw upon strength and say, we're suffering like, how Christ suffered, and this gives us strength. But also the ways in which their crops were being targeted, the corn crops were being targeted, for them was a wound to their whole collective identity, because the Mayans described themselves as the people of the corn. And therefore, it wasn't just their livelihood that was destroyed, but also their sense of collective identity. I'm making this point because, as the scholar Martin Barrault described, often when we think of psychological trauma, we kind of tend to forget or to give less relevance to the social elements of trauma. And he introduced the term psychosocial trauma to exactly describe what happens to groups and populations who are in distress. It's not just individuals, but it's the whole society that is being affected. And therefore, responses that may appear abnormal in normal circumstances are actually quite normal. Being hypervigilant if there is a conflict is normal. But what is important is to address the social as well as the psychological to regain a level of normality and to promote social recovery. So my first point in a way is to say when we think of trauma and psychological trauma, it's important to think of it in terms of ecologies and traumas and different levels that are interconnected. My second reflection on trauma comes from the word trauma and the writing of a psychologist and scholar called Renos Papadopoulos. In his book, Therapeutic Care for Refugees, he writes something very interesting about trauma. It goes back to the meaning of the word, the etiology, the Greek verb trauma. It says that the verb in Greek, titrosko, means to pierce. And the root of the verb is teiro, which in Greek has two meanings. It means to rub in and also to rub out, to rub away. Trauma then is being understood as a mark that is being left on a person or a collective or a nation as a result of something that is being rubbed onto him or onto her or onto them. And depending on the way in which the rubbing takes place, the result can be something like have two outcomes. It can be the trauma that could either be an injury being rubbed in, but it can also be a new life where the person can start from with previous priorities erased and in a way growing through suffering, rubbing off. And many scholars in the post traumatic growth field would argue that we need to also look at trauma as a wound, but also as a wound that can heal, but also as a wound that can create something new. Um, this is my second point. And therefore, I just want to, in a way, for us to think about so, how can we support the reduction of trauma and the well being of populations like forced migrants, people who are in humanitarian situations, those who are in situations of war, those who are in prolonged displacements, those who live in precarity even when they have resettlement in the country and spend years in refugee camps. For me, it's important to, and I'm adding a third component here beyond the ecologies and the rubbing in and rubbing off, which is that we need to also think about the relationship between traumatic events, which are external and we all experience in life, trauma, which is the wound that is the outcome of it, but also the fact that not everybody who's been wounded will become traumatized because the relationship is not a deterministic. We also need to think that our mental health is mediated by a whole range of internal and external resources. So the whole field of coping and resilience plays an important role for us in understanding the cultural idioms, the support systems, the mechanisms that individuals in situations of distress draw upon to overcome the traumatic events. And the role of, one could say, the humanitarian field is to promote the resilience of communities and to understand what coping strategies and mechanisms exist. And for instance, the idea behind psychological first aid is that it's the communities themselves that could be actually the first ones who can support one another during in situations of crisis. But one of the priorities of humanitarian interventions with displaced refugee populations in distress is in a way to protect and improve their well-being. And this can be done in two main ways. One is to reduce the stressors, and the second one is to strengthen the protective factors that play a role. And I want to give an example of my work in the context of Eastern Africa, and in particular, in the context of the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide that took place in 1994, where many children were being displaced and separated from their families. And as part of our kind of psychosocial work, we were working with NGOs to try and, first of all, to look at what were the protective factors that were playing a role in children's life. So children is known are best protected even though they experience traumatic events if they are with a family. So one of the first actions was to make sure that there were minimal disruptions to families as they were moving or as they were crossing borders. So for instance, they might have been given bracelets at different checkpoints to make sure that if they were temporarily displaced, they could be immediately reunited with their families. But also, there were, for those who had lost their families because of the conflict or because of displacement, a second strategy was to make sure that those protective mechanisms could be reestablished in another form. So, for instance, one of the first actions was to promote family unification, with both with the nuclear family, but also with the extended family. So that photos were being placed of children who had lost their family members across different routes and in different villages and across the border in refugee camps, so that the community could see the child, recognize the child, and then create this kind of family unification pathway. But also, in terms of telling stories, children were encouraged to tell their story, to draw the places where they came from, to give some indications of where they might have come from. Was it near a river? Was it in a mountain? So that the family reunification process could also be aided through their stories and participation. And the third mechanism is if there are no families, if there are no extended families, then the role of aid workers in the community is to create compensatory systems that can assist. And in this case, the promotion of foster family, encouraging community refugee families in refugee camps to host the children is something that is a cultural practice and can be encouraged in these situations. So I've just given you a very brief kind of take on my kind of reading of trauma and psychological trauma, that it is needs to be understood in its kind of cultural context, in what it does and the mediating factors that play a role, and also in the ways in which communities can be very important in promoting resilience and the well-being of the populations who are in distress, and the ways in which anybody who intervenes, whether a professional or a community worker or an aid worker, would need to always keep in mind the protective factors that need to be strengthened and the negative stressors that need to be reduced in promoting well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Georgia. That was a really rich, sensitive, and percipient interpretation of the topic. Thank you very much. I would now request Miss Mattoo to kindly take the session ahead by sharing your insights on the given topic. Over to you, Ms. Mattoo.
Thank you, Deyasini. And I want to thank Ankur and Giorgia for putting forward their views on this topic of conflict and violence induced forced migrations. And I deeply appreciate the academic, the knowledge and the vision that you guys bring to the table every time we have these discussions, especially with the people on ground, journalists who are always running in the field, because uh, it's like I think that academics provide foundation of strengthening pillars to the study of forced migrations or any topic for that matter. I would like to start with a small set of words I keep on writing from time to time on migration. So there are a couple of words I would like to, and I would also go quickly on it because I know we have 9 questions to answer collectively. So 30 lost years, 8 rented places, none of the walls to be called my own, none of the gates to be called my home, hiding bones of Kashmir in the skins of our hearts, none of the lanes familiar, all unknown. 30 lost years, 8 rented places. It depicts, what kind of nomadic life I've lived along with thousands and lakhs of others who are like me. And uh, since the best experience that I have is my own, I would like to start with a few excerpts from my story here and there. Me, my family, my parents, my grandparents, and it is quite similar for each one of us who has struggled. Worse for some who lost their loved ones in the chaos before 1990, just in 1990. Um, so our minds, whenever we talk to each other, I'm talking about conflict basically in Kashmir because I have studied it here and I've lived here, and my our minds are like 10 empty buses running on the Kashmir highway at the same time. We are angry, we are emotional at the same time. We try to look for solutions and try to find too many problems. So there are 10 thoughts running at the same time in our heads all the time, and we are the examples of overthinkers, you can say, after all the aftermath. So I'm also stressing on the psychological impact it has had on
Mhm.
each one of us. So uh, you know uh, we were well read. Kashmiri Pandits were well read. Ankur has done a great study on it. Like he said, we were well read once, and now we were just struggling to be fed suddenly by 1995. And it has been long road away from home, and it's still a journey that all of us, especially our elders, think they are on. I would like to focus only on the mental aspects of the migration that our community has gone through, because we're discussing the psychological trauma associated with migration, forced migration. I was born in 89, and I was not even one when my parents had to run away from their house in the middle of the night on 19th of January. And I would like to tell you about the unpreparedness of their departure, in terms of the fact that my mother was not even wearing slippers when she ran, and the run didn't have to look like it was running. It had to be just a fast walk, maybe, not to alert the neighbors or the elements that would threaten their lives. And they just took us to the nearest town that, along with thousands of others at that time, did to Jammu. And the lives of everyone have been similar after that. Shanty camps, in situations where you run away from a four-story house to a tent, or a torn tent, places, and running after a truck full of potatoes and tomato to survive every day. The drasticity of the situation, the contrast that the situation has shown 30 years ago, is something that the trauma will not go very soon. It will take I think 2 generations more, because the scars are permanent, I guess. And the disease is that, Ankur was also talking about it. We saw a lot. I have done a lot of research in the Kashmiri Pandit community due to my work in broadcast journalism, in TV and in radio. I got in touch with um, too many people from the community, spoke to each one of them. I tried to bring out a lot of stories through my work on radio and on TV. And through stories, I realized how similar the stories were. There were these lifestyle diseases of, I think he mentioned diabetes, Ankur. I would like to also mention Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and the nature of forgetting and landing into the same lanes, the bylanes of Kashmir every night before you go to sleep. That moment between falling in deep sleep and when you're awake, at that time, many of our elders still feel they are living in that bylane, and they just maybe faintly, if you ask them, "Hey, where are you right now?" They will tell you, "Hey, I'm in Chanpura, I'm in Hapakatil." And it is funny. It is funny because even after 30 years, they think they're still there, and it's a tragedy in itself, how um, what all the community has gone through collectively. I have also mentioned in numerous anthologies the essays that I've written about tragedies that befell the community, not just in 1990, but also much before that. I was part of a family, sadly, that 9 members of the family were massacred in 1931, and just my grandfather remained. He was an orphan. He was 6 years old at that time, and he ran from the house, and the house was set on fire along with 9 people. And his story, basically, after that, I have mentioned it a couple of times in news also, because the person, while even on his deathbed, the only thing he wanted was to die in his homeland. So the psychological trauma for a migrant, the displacement of a migrant is, while he may start earning again, his mind, his soul is still there, and it just doesn't settle his heart. And when the heart is not settled, the mind is not settled. Where will the mental health go? Mm, I would also like to focus on the poverty that we saw, that I saw. Some of us luckily were able to come out of it. We were lucky, but many of us are still living in shanty camps, in those MG accommodations, crammed up in small spaces, 10 people in a room, just surviving. Some of them are surviving on relief, some of them don't even have that. And uh, through my personal work, I have seen what drugs have done in these societies, where there is where the elders are tormented, and they are so distracted and they are disheartened from what has happened to them, that the youth is not even is looking for inspiration, is not able to find much from around, and is going into drugs, and the menace is just so discouraging, especially for a community that was known for being well read, for doing good in academics, for holding good positions. Right now, so many of our youngsters are struggling in rehabs, and that is what migration also does. I would also like to talk about alienation, the cultural alienation that comes along with migrating to a different place. Like, somebody going to a totally contrast kind of a city, or a town, and restarting their lives. It becomes very difficult, because the acceptability might not come readily, like we saw. The acceptability might not be there at all. The struggle may be lifelong after that. And language, the culture, the day-to-day inferiority complexes that you feel, the problems in employment, mistrust, the fight for jobs and reservations. I mean, this is never ending for migrants who move from one place to another. And I would also like to say that, we should not be forgetting about these previous migrations, and Georgia also talked about many other migrations. We should be learning from history so that we do not see forced migrations happening. Of course, some of the migrations might be good. We can study some migrations that have happened in history for economy, better prospects, but not forced. Forced and armed migrations are completely different. uh, I've done a lot of social work also through in COVID, in the pandemic, because our topic involved something about the pandemic. I would like to say that in this pandemic, I saw something special. I saw people come together that all of us saw. I saw people of the community come together, because this community, this Kashmiri Pandit community, is scattered throughout the world now, and we have not seen many instances where they have come together. But this time, people from US were sending concentrators and support, oxygen support to each other, and social media helped a lot in that, in connecting people. You see, people sometimes. I recently met somebody, a colleague, and he saw by chance his friend that he got separated from in 89. He saw that guy today after so many years, and the emotions you see in them, meeting in a different city, uh, losing contact, people losing contact with their loved ones. This is what I want to talk about. It does create psychological trauma, losing contact with people, and you certainly cannot expect people to make relations again, from zero. We're human beings. And lastly, I would like to say that it's not just the KP migration. We saw the daily displacement of 2020. Ankur must be also aware of that. So many migrants, so many, and the tragedy of the movement. So while it was not due to armed conflict, it was definitely due to chaos, and definitely due to a pandemic, and the faces we saw on TV, the faces we saw on social media. I think it did affect us. So the problems of discounted history that Ankur talked about, or distortion of facts that come after 30 years, when somebody's been asking for justice for 30 years and facts have been distorted, hopelessness creeps in. And like Georgia mentioned about hypervigilance, I see that in our community a lot. We are hyper vigilant and alert all the time, and uh, just need a trigger to get anxiety again, as a the collective, I think she mentioned psychosocial trauma. It's also you know something to study about in the community. So yeah, that's about me, and that's what it's a very personalized experience, and I'm sure you know it does something, it brings something to the table.
Thank you, Ms. Mattoo, for sharing with us your perceptive insights and offering us a glimpse into the reality of Kashmir, heart wrenching, and for the wonderfully evocative lines you penned. Thank you very much. Such profundity in the lines. Thank you once again. Moving on to the question and answer segment. My first question is to Professor Giorgia. It focuses on the performativity of education. Like Professor, when refugees rebuild their lives, one of the main components that act as a stepping stone through the process is education, right? How can education play an important role in the psychosocial well being of those affected by forced migration, as well as help in finding refugee voices? Professor?
Yes, thank you. This is a very important question. And in my opinion, education plays a very important role in the psychosocial well being of forced migrants, and especially young people, but also migrants and forced migrants in general. I think that when we think of, let's say, education in primary school, children who have been displaced, they're confused. They've lost a sense of, where they are, what they want to do. Even going to school provides them with a routine. And by doing that, in a way, it gives them a certain kind of stability when they are amidst confusion and uncertainty. It also gives them like a safe space where they can play, where that can be supportive when they are surrounded by unfamiliar new environments, whether it's in refugee camps, in internally displaced camps, or when they are resettled. It also gives them a positive identity. We know that refugee label sometimes carries mixed messages, but being a student in a school can give children, young people, but also adults in a way, a positive identity that can help them to cope better with their situation. And also because in a way education is around thinking about the future, moving on, learning for the future. It also can give them hope when they have left past experiences and events behind, and they're living through a present which is uncertain. So I think education has a very important kind of psychosocial function just by virtue of being there. But also it has an important role in relation to integration in host societies, or in the places where refugees and forced migrants find themselves. Because, for instance, and I'm located in the UK, when migrants come, the ability, being able to take language courses is a first stepping stone for them to be able to become autonomous in their daily life, to be able to move around, to go to the shops, to speak to members of the host society. But also when they take, after language courses, they take vocational courses or higher education. That opens for them the opportunities to, in a way, to integrate. So it's a social bridge, both in economic terms, but also in social relational ways. I also think that education plays an important role in giving refugee voices, as you pointed out. And I want to conclude with a short example of the work that we've done in our university with migrants at the border, including young migrants. We have set up the migrants at the border between France and the UK, so we've reached Europe. We set up what we called Life Stories Project a few years ago, where we used to give workshops to people at the border who are in a very transient situation. So these workshops were very flexible, very kind of dynamic, and respected, the needs of these migrants to be available, but not be available at the same time. But these workshops were used narratives as a foundation. So they were telling the stories of people as a starting point for conversation. They were using both oral stories, written narratives of Malala, Nelson Mandela, etc., and also visual stories. So we had, photographer, we had an artist coming and working with the team. And then the students, at the end of this kind of mini workshops, were presenting their story after reflecting. They were narrating their story through this educational, narrative stories project. They were narrating their stories, reflecting on their journeys, on their experiences of violence, on their long journeys, on their being stuck at the border. And these stories then became collected and published in a book that is called Voices from the Jungle, that is now being used not only for the migrants, but also as a form of testimony for those who are located in, for host societies that often don't know about, the personal testimonies of migrants and refugees who cross borders, and all the difficulties and challenges that they face, and the strength that, they carry with them, and the opportunities that their voice could give to improvement in host societies. And I think that is good. And in that respect, I also want to thank the previous speaker, because again, I find that every time we hear personal stories, they just add a different dimension. And in a way, for me, it just embodied what I was talking about in a much kind of more interesting way, because it was the personal, it was the social, it was the economic, it was everything there, but also from a lived experience, which I think is always very important. So thank you for that kind of mixture of the panel.
Thank you, Professor Giorgia, for sharing with us your wonderful insights. I also wanted to bring another aspect to discussion. As refugees experience high rates of traumatic events, abuse, and stigma, they often resort to alcohol and other psychoactive substances for comfort. So, this may not only lead to severe health complications, but may also contribute to the massive corrosion of interpersonal relationships and social harmony that you had addressed in the initial part of your conversation. So, what sort of preventive and treatment services should be employed to curb this matter? Over to
Um,
you, Professor.
Yes, this is again an important matter, because if we put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who is maybe dependent on alcohol because of so many stresses, internally they're finding a balance that helps them to cope. However, coping can be adaptive, can be functional, but can also be dysfunctional when it affects relationships, it affects health, and so on and so on. So the ways in which we can respond to this situation is by providing different types. There are different degrees or levels of preventative measures and supportive measures. And in fact, the mental health guidelines use the image of a pyramid where most populations don't need support, but there are certain groups that maybe need peer support, or may need family support, or may need focused specialist support through, maybe more dedicated counselors. But I always think that also there is a need to understand the cultural dynamics in providing support. But it is a community problem, and of course, the preventative measure will be to address the root causes. Often, people in community that are displaced have lost status, have their identities undermined. So, if we find ways to redress some of these mechanisms by re-establishing status, re-establishing a level of identity and community, those could be ways to redress some of these mechanisms for the population in general, through maybe awareness raising kind of workshops. But also for those who are already in a situation of vulnerability, there might be group or other treatments that could be used, or peer support mechanisms or resources within the community.
Thank you, Professor Georgia, for sharing your insights with us. Moving on, my next question is to Professor Datta. Professor Datta, it so happens that after the painful experience of migration due to conflict, a great deal of psychological trauma and suffering is associated with the gradual remaking of their economic, social, and political lives. Could you throw some light on the varied levels of stress that impact this rebuilding?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Uh, I mean, it's actually a pretty vast question to address very quickly, but I'll put it this way: it depends on what we, I guess, see as stress, of that which can impose stress in terms of remaking life. I mean, this I kind of draw on a lot of the work of anthropologists like we have us in this case. What are we remaking? Let's say after any kind of situation which causes a break um, with something that has caused your life to sort of have a radical break from what it was to what it is now. Um, One is talking about, of course, remaking economic life. In many cases, you are a lot of displaced, a lot of refugees end up trying to find a way to get some money in the first place, right? You lose income sources, and so on. And the fact of the matter is, not everyone is always that fortunate in the long term. Uh, One is dependent, I guess, on immediate sources of economic relief, um, which comes with a lot of baggage because there is a question of dignity coming in, right? It's how we even talk about unemployment benefits and how they often get dismissed. So the question is, what does it mean to be on relief? Does that relief help you um, make up for lost status, given that your past you perhaps have enjoyed? Those who are now refugees may have enjoyed a certain quality of life. So, does that kind of humanitarian assistance meet that end? And there's a stress of that where you can see the gulf between what the kind of life you led in terms of quality of life with what you're being forced to live with now. And it can actually have very odd ramifications. So, for example, a lot of people will talk about how the relief received is thoroughly inadequate, and the relief was financial aid, food aid. If you're lucky, you got relief. If you were a government category migrant, you just got your basic salary. I mean, Ms. Mattoo can also, I guess, corroborate on this. Um, but this was where the problem started. It is absolutely inadequate. Anybody could see if this is what your life was before. However, from the point of relief agencies, this is a lot. I mean, actually, this is a lot. What more do they want? They're getting this. They should be grateful. And it's this tension within any kind of humanitarian policy, and of course, in this case, the state. And this would also get picked. So as it is, you can see a kind of compromising on the question of dignity on the immediate side. And on top of that, others see you as fortunate. Even others would say, hey, they're just getting money for nothing. It's that kind of thing. So there's that stress of that, which is, of course, tied to a kind of economic security. Um, there's also other kinds of stress that comes up in terms of what kind of a life do I remake then? Do I engage in professions I most probably would not have done before, but I now get into as well? Um, so you'd have, so there's one chap I remember very clearly. He worked as a printer, and he learned the skills of a printer. He didn't finish school. Like, he finished school, but forget about it. There's no college. He lived in the camp, and he would point out a lot of young men as well who were university graduates, but who would sit unemployed. So this guy, at one level, I would say that this chap was actually being proactive. He went and got skills. He's got a job. He was a skilled worker. Like, he had skills. He wasn't an unskilled worker. But in the end of the day, I didn't go to college. So these chaps who went got a degree but don't want to work, or like are unable to find work, but also will not do that kind of work. It's this tension of how do I see lost status? And I think, which goes back again to a large question. Dislocation, displacement isn't simply just about refugees, but it's about a loss of a quality of life one recognized as well. And this one sees this a lot in the case of where, for the want of a better phrase, one sees when you have refugees with a lot of people who one would call white collar, with certain levels of education, who had a certain standard of living, that sense of loss is even more palpable. Whether that, and so there is the stress of trying to recoup losses you may never get back. I saw this in Jammu. One saw this even with the 1947 partition refugees, where, let's say, East Bengali Hindus who would be called, let's say, Bhadraloks back in the old country, but you're kind of reduced to being working class now. If that's so, and there's that struggle to try and retain that status. So I think that's one element of stress, but that's also something that's interested me as well. How does one deal with the present when you're trying to recoup the past in terms of even losses in status, or you find other paths because there's also changed circumstance. I mean, this is a point that actually is very interestingly made with scholars who worked in the former Yugoslavia. I'm thinking of Steph Johnson. So he talks about Bosnian refugees who were displaced with the civil war, and so they became refugees in Europe. Um, when they left, it was Yugoslavia falling to pieces, but it was Yugoslavia, which was a socialist republic. When they got repatriated back, it's no longer Yugoslavia, the country they knew, and it's now no longer a socialist Yugoslavia they knew. It's Bosnia, and it's made to go through neoliberal capital reforms. And so they're when they go home, it's the country's not there. You might be back in physical space, but the entire economic system has drastically changed. So automatically, you're even more handicapped. You have it's kind of like I've come home to remake my life, and I have to re-educate after a gap of how I adjust, and there's the stress of that. So, I mean, these are some of the things that still intrigue me. Um, yeah, but it's also how it's seen by others.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Datta. Also, since today we are talking about psychological trauma, I see the necessity of this question to be addressed, and that is due to certain administrative or legal reasons. You know, refugees are repeatedly asked to recall very detailed memories about
Yes,
their first migration experiences, right? So
yes,
the constant revisits to the violent incidents pose a hindrance to their psychological healing. So if you could also tell us about some of the impacts that these have on the refugees, with
right.
special reference to displaced Kashmiri Pandits, and in what ways can they overcome them?
Um, I mean, this is entirely my perspective. Of course, Miss Mattoo would, of course, be able to share much more on this with a great deal of richness. Um, I'll be honest. I often found it very. So narratives work in two forms. At one level, there's a public narrative, which is what circulates, say, in public. So it's what circulates in the news. It's what circulates as public discourse, and a lot of those narratives are fairly uniform. You'll see that from, say, politicians, community leaders, and so on. So that's one kind of narrative. What intrigued me most, of course, were individual personal narratives. But I think there are many narratives that people also hold on. Before I actually talk about, one is, of course, repeating the same story of pain is revisiting the same kind of trauma. There's also a risk sometimes, and this is pointed out by several other scholars as well, whether we're making people repeat the narrative mechanically, so it takes a fixed form at one level. And again, part of the problem of sharing a narrative, and this is something we see with, say, Holocaust studies and even partition studies, there's a certain format a testimony takes for it to be also understood. Veena Das's work, particularly, let's say, on the 1984 anti-Sikh riots, well, it was a pogrom, really, 1984 anti-Sikh pogrom in Delhi, which took place in 84, she observed something very interesting, where where the women were trying to narrate what happened, because you have to narrate, otherwise the police or law cannot take action. The problem is there's a certain format a legal narrative takes. So even if they're narrating, you had a system that wasn't able to take it in. So you have the pain of reliving the day you may have lost your loved one. However, you have to make it fit a certain format for it to go into a first information report, which has this other pain, because there you don't care about the emotions or the other aspects. You just want dry facts, which you can use to build a case. Eventually, she writes that a lot of these women she was working with learned how to pick up the narrative. And in that sense, the narrative becomes professionalized. So I think there is that element at one level. In some cases, you're reliving the loss, and that is painful. The question is, sometimes for states, maybe NGOs, or even academics for that matter, you have to fit the narrative for a certain purpose. For the state, it's for action. For humanitarian agencies, to initiate some action. I don't mean to sound cynical about people in my field, but you also make it. You have to make it fit. It has to connect with your research question, right? I'm just claiming to be an academic. I'm not involved with anything, but you have to make it fit a certain research question, so you can make a general argument. The question is, am I losing texture there? And the question is, am I doing justice to that person's experience, or have I reduced it as mere data? So that's one thing. That's one thing I still struggle with, actually. So, what is it I do? And I remember this because I didn't really. If someone didn't want to talk, I wouldn't really force them, or I talk about other stuff. I mean, it could be memories of just home, and I often found it was much better to have a conversation about. Well, can you tell me what life was like in your neighborhood before? I don't want to be a voyeur. I mean, I don't want to be voyeuristic about it. Can you just tell me what life is like? To even if they wanted to talk about the cricket match going on, because it's also essential to see that we connect these narratives to human beings, and I think that is very important. So there was a point where if someone didn't really want to talk, I wouldn't push them that much unless they volunteer themselves, and I found that would make it more natural, and to also give it time. Because that's all. If you keep making people say what they want to say, it does become mechanical. The other thing, though, and I remember being told this. So when I was a PhD student, so I was still very new. I did other kinds of work. I was much younger. So I would come in saying, like, here, I'm out here to do research on this and this. And I remember this person asking me, what do I get out of telling you my story? Because I'm not paying them. They're not getting paid. I'm not bringing any relief. I'm just a PhD student. It's just going to be data and a thesis. It's not that there'll be any kind of major change in their life. I mean, the benefits for me as a researcher and a scholar are there. I get my research. I get to write my thesis and write a paper, and and do what academics do. But what is in it for them also to share the narrative, almost on call? And I remember this one gentleman said, I didn't go back to him, but at the same time, he said, that's all we are, good for research. But then I'm coming to him, most probably I was definitely not the first. I was most probably one in so many. And the actual benefit of that work isn't really accruing to people. So I think that's. I mean, it sounds a bit cynical, but it's. I don't think. No, I won't say cynical. It sounds a bit disheartening, but so one has to constantly think of ways of how one could take the research forward. But yeah, I don't. I know this doesn't entirely answer the question because the stuff I'm still struggling with as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Datta. That was indeed wonderful. And now I'll move on, and this will be my last question to Miss Mattoo. So sometimes it is seen that media representation of refugees is inadequate or inauthentic, let's say. In fact, at times women are underrepresented or disproportionately absent from the news on migration and refugees. So if you could throw some light on the impact of misrepresentation or underrepresentation on the refugees and their descendants.
So definitely, I think all of us know the correct answer. We have a lot of complaints, all of us, including us in media, the way media projects, the media. Like Ankur said, that with academics also, um, you know, we have to try to fit in the there are, like, suppose there are five bottles and we have to fit in all the experiences of people, all the interviews we do into those five bottles. That is what media also does, sadly. But then, media should step up uh, the kind of fit in, or the kind of opinions we get out. We have to be more careful, and more than anything, we should be careful about the truth coming out. And the truth can only come out through stories, through people and their narrations, people talking directly in the media. The impact. I was in radio for 6 years, and the very fact that I was lucky enough to talk to people on everyday basis, because you had to get people to speak. Radio is such an intimate medium. A person speaking on radio, a person speaking about their experiences, there's no visual. Any impact that a person can have on radio is only through their voice, through their experiences, through their emotions. So I, as a development journalist, understand that how important stories are, and that too directly from people. So what media should be doing is to not give opinions so much, and not to fit in into narratives, but to let the people speak. Because the greatest of affects, what affects us most is when somebody is speaking to us, or we read these stories on humans of New York or humans of Bombay, these stories directly from people. This is what uh, we remember. We'll remember these stories. So I focus totally on stories, and I would want, if there are people from media watching us, or students of media, the only way that they can create an impact and bring in a policy change is by bringing out the stories directly, without any adulteration, I would call it. And social media has an important role to play in this. I would say more than ever about the positivity about social media, because I have been able to use it very nicely, and we are a set of people who bring out stories almost on everyday basis. And right now, a person's true power, nobody can put out a story out there, his own story, and the story can reach millions and millions of people. Imagine the sword you have in hand. I mean, it can either protect you, or it can either the other person. So yeah, I think I got my point forward. Another thing that media should stop doing is to stop shoving mics in the faces of people in adversity. And I mean, a person is walking, he's in the process of migration. You cannot be shoving mics and cameras in their faces and asking, hey, how are you feeling right now? Give them time. Give people time to process their emotions. Because we're talking about psychological trauma. We need to give people time to process, to come out with the right kind of words. Otherwise, I think Ankur also mentioned, there was this term he mentioned. I really like that term. people also try to speak in a collective fashion, and they have developed this robotic, you know, uh, Kashmiris speak to a lot of migrants, would be speaking to a lot of human activists, human rights activists, and lawyers, and journalists, and academicians, people who are doing their studies. So they develop a very robotic, non-emotional kind of a way of speaking. They're used to these interviews, and like Ankur said, we have to find ways. Along with finding ways to get through to their stories, we also have to give them time to process their emotions. So that is what media should care about. And its representation, we talked about, means a representation that can only happen when the stories are twisted, the stories are given from a third perspective, the stories need to come out directly from people without too many sound effects or visual effects. I mean, that is too distracting. So, like, I mean, media, and we're trying to do a bit in a better way. More and more people should be writing. Uh, Twitter is full of articles of personalized stories, and people really like that is really being accepted, and people really like directly stories coming out from migrants. So I'm looking at all the positive sides here of media.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you, Miss Mattoo. That was a wonderful way to end the session on. And I would like to thank each one of you for being with us today and share your valuable wisdom for our project. It was an absolute honor to have you all amongst us today. And this is to state that we are seeking submissions in the form of stories, poems, and essays as part of our project. The registrations are also open for our Advanced Writing Workshop Season 4. To know more, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. We are coming up with a series of academic discussions for our project to be live streamed on our page. So don't forget to stay tuned and bye for today. A humble thanks to all of you for supporting us in our endeavor. Stay safe, all of you, and bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.